I'm going to give a little made-for-YouTube commercial here, because a very good friend of mine has just published a book that it is really worth reading. Joseph Selby wrote the book called The Physics of God, and this is in the genre of trying to reconcile spirituality and science. And he is qualified intellectually to do this rather challenging job on the scientific side, and more qualified than many other authors on the spiritual side. He's a lifelong member of Ananda, very dedicated devotee, and just has an extremely interesting and intelligent mind, and an amazing capacity to take enormous disparate bits of information and weave them into an interesting whole. I am the canary in the cage for this book, because I cannot understand these concepts at all. But I can actually understand this book. So I think anyone who is interested would really like it. His other book is The Yugas, which he co-wrote with David Steinmetz, which is, both books are similar in the sense of vast amounts of material that is not easy to understand and integrate. He's done a brilliant job with both of them. This is not published by Crystal Clarity. This is published by an independent publisher, so you can find it online, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Now, we'll go on with the rest of our webinar. The last webinar, where we left this, I left you all hanging. Arjuna had driven the chariot, asked Krishna to drive the chariot between the positive and the negative forces, and Arjuna had just declared that he wasn't going to fight. And in that cliffhanging moment, we ended the webinar, and now no one knows whether Arjuna is going to fight or not. And as I was saying last week, Arjuna's dilemma at going to war, and Krishna's answer to Arjuna's dilemma to going to war, is what the whole Bhagavad Gita is about. The dilemma of the devotee, realizing what it is that he really is going to have to do, symbolized by this warrior king facing the dilemma of actual physical war, and just quailing at the thought of what's asked of him, which is exactly what we all go through. This, I'm going to spend a moment on this point. This is where the spiritual path comes to sooner or later. There's this long cycle among devotees, and I've experienced it myself, and I've certainly seen it in others, where you somehow think that you're going to get to play both sides, that you'll get to gather everything that you want, and you're still going to be really serious for God, and He's never going to really take any of that away from you. And there comes a point, and this is Arjuna's point at this war, where you just realize that there's no compromise on this. And the mind spins in all kinds of directions looking for compromise, because the real the heroism required when you realize that there's no compromise means that every single little oscillation that isn't in line with your infinite self will have to be straightened out. And it's daunting. There's just no other word for it. It's daunting. But that is the point of understanding we have to come to. And this is what Krishna begins to address here. So, he first addressed the real simple objective question, which actually really needs to be addressed, which is, in an external sense, is there ever any such thing as a righteous war? There's an inclination, partly out of idealism and partly out of the same tendency that I was speaking of, the sort of the hope that we can get divine sanction for what we would like to be true. I mean, no living, sane person really wants war and all the destruction and waste and suffering that implies. But there's also this aspect of life that has to be faced, which is that some things are worth either risking or giving up your life for. And that kind of acceptance is also part of what the spiritual path is. And as we go through this, I'll talk about that phrase, giving up your life, because that's what Arjuna and Krishna end up discussing. But what are there things that I want to die for? And that I would be willing to die for. And so the question of war is just simply that question. If my country is invaded, if my freedoms are threatened, if the freedoms of others are threatened, if barbarism tries to take over countries, as is happened most notably in World War II, but has happened repeatedly, is there a point at which one will lay down his life or her life before you allow that to happen? And the Gita says, yes, just as simple as that. There are such points. And then this has to be balanced against Patanjali's teaching of ahimsa, which says absolute harmlessness. But in the autobiography of a yogi, just as fundamental a book as that, Master asks the question. There's a little scene played out in Autobiography of a Yogi where a mosquito is really annoying Master, and he raises his hand to crush it. And then it crosses his mind that maybe harmlessness would require that he not be allowed to crush it. But Sri Yukteswar says, well, you've already crushed it in your own mind, you might as well go ahead and kill it. And then he goes and talks about true ahimsa. This is a world in which absolutes cannot exist, because everything has two sides to it. There's one way you want to do it, and then there seems to always be balancing another duality. So Swami uses an example that Gandhi used, because Gandhi advocated an absolute ahimsa. And the classic question that was asked of Gandhi, if a madman came into your village and started killing everyone, what would you do? And Gandhi's answer was, I'd have him kill me first. But Swami's response to that was, what good would that do? Because then he would go ahead and kill everyone else. And Sri Yukteswar says that as long as you don't will to do someone harm, it's the evil of the heart that really binds you. But if you simply recognize that harm must be done in order to accomplish a greater good, that is simply dealing with reality as it is. And that in itself is an extremely important principle. I was talking to a friend who lives out in ranch land up in northern Washington state in the U.S. And she has 300 acres of grazing land for horses and cattle. And seeds blow across the border from Canada, because they're right up near the border of Canada, and Canada doesn't control things as much as the U.S. does. Seeds blow across the border, and there are these exceedingly invasive plants that are starting to take over, that would take over the grazing land. If left unchecked, those plants would completely obliterate the capacity to use that land as it's being used now for grazing. So there's something called the weed board. It probably has a fancier name than that, but all the farmers all the ranchers call it the weed board. And the weed board tells you that if you don't get rid of these plants, then they'll come in and do it themselves and charge you money. Well, one of them is this. It was actually interesting. I had this picture when she said she had to get rid of these weeds. I thought of some suburban lawn, and I saw this poor woman crawling on her hands and knees over 300 acres of grazing land. It was just like an impossible picture. So she actually showed me what one of them looks like, and it was interesting because it was spiky and thorny and ragged and aggressive looking. It really looked like something that was threatening the peaceful grazing land, but it was also huge and extremely obvious. And so she could, burn its seed pods and pull it up. But there's another kind that's much more difficult, and there was no choice. It has to be poisoned. And she was talking to me about how reluctant she was to poison it. That goes into the ecosystem there. But it's already compromised. Everything is already compromised. So you can't just find a clear path in which something isn't also affected. If she doesn't take it out, well, she doesn't have a choice, because the weed board would come in and take it out for her. So even that, she doesn't have a choice. She can't get it out physically. It just has to. So I was talking about that I came to the spiritual path into the life of Ananda very early in my life. And I met a woman who was a Stanford student, as it happened. She was in her early 20s or maybe 20. And she was attracted to this path and also afraid of joining it, because she thought she would lose more than she would gain, which is actually the theme of this chapter. And so she asked me the question if I was happy. And I said, well, I am, but I don't think that's really the right question to ask. She was wanting me to verify the benefits of this path. I said I was an extremely idealistic person all through my life. I still am. I said, and I've lived a life where I don't feel that I've ever really had to compromise my ideals, which is it's a really quite a statement. And I myself, when I said it, I thought about it. I've had to understand my ideals on a deeper level. Just like in this case, Arjuna is asserting that the highest principle here is that he not go to war. And Krishna is going to explain to him how that is not the highest principle, that there's something higher, and it's duty, and it's an understanding of higher realities than what is just in front of him. So I have definitely had to expand my understanding of what my ideals are, but never, and I have to honestly say that because I've thought about this very carefully, I've never had to compromise my ideals. No, that's because of my understanding of this path, because every time I've been up against any dilemma, there was always an avenue of elevated thinking that would lead me righteously out of whatever dilemma that was. Does that mean it's always been easy or effortless? No, that would be a tremendous misstatement. The capacity to hold on to your ideals when sorely tested is one of the things that makes us very strong. But to be able to have made one's way all the way through life without having to compromise, it speaks about this path. It doesn't really speak about me. It speaks about this path, that there's a continuous thread of profound understanding. And when I first got onto the path of self-realization, especially after I met Swami Kriyananda, that was, for me, it was like I'd been holding my breath. When I think about my life before Ananda, that's how I feel about it. I feel like I was holding my breath all the time, just hoping to find a way to live that was not a terrible compromise, that just was settling. And I don't mean that in a really, awful way, like just living an ordinary life is nothing to be ashamed about. But it wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I desperately wanted. I desperately wanted a thread of high idealism that I could hold on to, but I couldn't find it. And then with the teaching of self-realization, as Master and Swami put it, and as Krishna puts it right here, there's that thread of idealism. And it does. It goes all the way down to the most mundane and all the way up to the most elevated. And that's why there's not been a need for compromise. Because even as whichever direction one moves, there's always a way to understand it. So this is where Arjuna is. It must be a terrible sin to kill. After all, Patanjali talked about ahimsa. And so that's the beginning of it. So Sri Yukteswar refines the ideal. The ideal is not just whether you accidentally step on bugs. And Master goes so far as to say, Sri Yukteswar and Master both, that harmful insects like mosquitoes or nuisance insects, he said it's quite appropriate to take their lives, because when you don't, disease and other results of uncleanliness result, and human life is compromised. And then here's another principle, which is the human body is capable of God realization. And whereas other creatures are equally manifestations of God in whatever form they're then living, but each animal each individual spirit living in animal form has to gradually evolve through its own stages of awareness until it has a human body, because then within the human body, and gradually as the ego develops and refines also, is the potential for God realization. And the whole point of the exercise, the whole point of creation, is that individual souls will realize their true selves and merge back into the infinite. So if there is a choice between preserving a human body and preserving the body of some other manifested form of life, according to the principles of self-realization, the human body has a higher priority. Now that doesn't mean that one should wantonly kill for food, because it's not essential. I mean, we can eat easily and live perfectly healthy, in fact, more healthy lives without deliberately taking the life of animals. But when disease-carrying insects or nuisance-bearing insects threaten the capacity of a human life either to continue or to continue to exist on an appropriate level, then even the law of ahimsa allows it. Isn't that fascinating? I've been on this path now for such a long time, and I've never met a dilemma that didn't have a very sensible resolution. I'm not asking all of you to accept it, but it certainly satisfied me, has satisfied me, and I'm not easy to satisfy. But the truth is there, and it isn't, it's the articulation of that truth that makes me so in love with Master's path and Swamiji's expression of it. But it's what they have articulated, they did not create. They simply articulated it really well, because it's the thread which is the reality behind it all, the whole thing, which is in fact, to come back, as I am doing, to this Gita, this is exactly how Krishna answers Arjuna, because the issue that Arjuna is facing is the taking of human life. And so what the verses here in chapter 2 are all about is what is the nature of human life, and especially what is the human body and what is death. What does it mean for the body to die? Because we take it from our perspective, which is so small, because it hurts us when human beings die, especially if we're attached to those human beings, and because we ourselves are attached to our own continued existence in the body that we have, which is appropriate to a point. We shouldn't wantonly throw it away. Master says it's quite irresponsible to wantonly throw it away, and suicide does not liberate you, for reasons I'll explain also. But that doesn't mean that the human body, the mere perpetuation of life in the body you have, is in itself the highest value. And so Krishna says to Arjuna that, this is your duty. You are a king. You've taken this on. And he goes specifically to say, in this case, this is your kingdom, and under the wrong ruler, all of these citizens are suffering. And you can't merely say, because you have an aversion to going to war, that you're just going to sacrifice their happiness and well-being. That's not your duty. How could that possibly be your duty? He said everyone will, and he says it in here, everyone will speak ill of you and say that you're a coward and that you're a fool, because you are, because you have a duty, and your responsibility to the well-being of all those citizens transcends your personal aversion to this issue. And then furthermore, he says, and I intended to read the Gita as we come to the verses. There's a lot of verses in this chapter, so I'm not sure I'll read them all, but I'll read some of them and give you the flavor of it. Oh, I know, there was one more part of this phrase that was really interesting. Swamiji says, because first Krishna says to Arjuna, he speaks of reincarnation, that the mere fact that you take away a body does not take away either the life force or the consciousness, that the body is the vehicle for eternal consciousness. The body itself is not eternal. It's self-evident that it isn't eternal. But the consciousness that animates the body is an eternal force. So as he says very simply, just as you take off a discarded garment, at the end of your day, or you outgrow it, or it becomes worn and you throw it away, but you, as your life continues, you just discard the garment. And so it's a very simple analogy to just go one step back from that, which is, this is a vehicle for our consciousness, but it's the consciousness that animates it. I don't know how many of you all have ever been present when somebody breathes their last, but it is the most astonishing thing how the body is the person right up to that very last. And then when the breath stops, the body becomes so self-evidently a discarded garment that even though it supposedly looks like the person, you realize in that moment that what you've always been relating to was the living vibration within that body. And as soon as that living vibration is removed, the body is just it really is literally nothing. It's just atoms and molecules or whatever it is that Joseph Selby explains in this book. It's all of that. That's what it is. It's not, it's not you anymore. But then he says, because what we're talking about allegorically is what the relatives, as I talked about last week, the relatives that we're slaying are actually those qualities within our own mental nature which are preventing us from perceiving reality as it is, that are preventing us from perceiving ourselves as we are. And in that sense, they are faults because they block us from true perception. And Swami uses the phrase, the energy invested in them becomes redirected towards spiritual pursuits. And this is the symbolic explanation of Krishna's flat statement that my devotee never dies, and no one who dies is lost. Nothing is lost. When this body falls off, everything about the consciousness continues. It's impossible ever to kill consciousness because consciousness is one with God. Consciousness can change form many times, move from one vehicle, one body to another, but the essential consciousness is never diminished and is never killed. So it appears to go away, but then it's redirected into another form. So in the same way, Krishna is explaining, Swamiji is explaining about when we change the habits that keep us away from God, we may be sentimentally attached to it. Oh, if I don't go out drinking with my buddies anymore, if I can't have a steak dinner every night, if I can't just sit down and watch all my television shows or drink beer or whatever you might say, how will I ever be happy? How will I ever find pleasure in life? How will I ever have any friends? But what that makes clear on the spiritual path is it's not like your capacity for happiness, enjoyment, friendship goes away at all. It's that same energy is redirected towards something else. And one spends one time doing other things that give you the same, give you a lift of consciousness, just as these things that you're now discarding, in this sense killing your own habits, you're killing them. But there was another phrase that Swami used, the word, the energy invested. And I was just thinking about that word invested, and I thought of another dimension of it, which is interesting to me. I was talking to a parent recently about his completely understandable anxiety about the future of his own children. Understandable in the sense that all parents worry about their children. Even the most yogic parents I know who keep it more within moderate bounds, but they never cease. I have not yet met a parent who ceases to be concerned about the well-being of his or her child. And my friend was, I felt mistakenly, and so I spoke to him about it in this way, talking about being more detached or less attached to the well-being of his children. And I told him I thought that vocabulary was completely unhealthy and that goal was impossible, that I just didn't know any parent, no matter how yogic, who was genuinely detached. I said, what you really want to develop is you want to develop faith. First of all, you want to develop faith in the destiny of your own child. Faith that soul, and we're often talking about adult children, we're not talking about little kids. I mean, in my conversations, that the destiny of that soul is going to follow whatever necessary trajectory it has to follow in order to progress, as all souls are trying to progress, toward God realization. And even if that pathway that particular soul has to travel causes an apparent period of suffering or even disaster in various ways, the parent has to have confidence in that soul's necessary destiny. So I thought about the word invest, and I thought, all of our terrible experiences and our really bad ideas, which seemed like a good idea at the time, because they always seemed like a good idea at the time. But all are really bad ideas that have karmic consequences, that are inconvenient and often unpleasant and sometimes catastrophic. It's an investment. It's an investment in our self-realization, because our self-realization would be impossible if that energy were not directed in that way. I mean, it's in the AA world, the addiction world, they talk about, they don't even just talk about hitting bottom, they talk about hitting a low bottom, because there's bottom and then there's bottom under that. You have to just really bounce all the way down to the lowest point that you're ever going to hit before there's that willingness to really accept I have to kill my relatives. I mean, you might not think of some poor addict unable to control whatever his craving is as being exactly comparable to Arjuna, but it is. It's exactly that. I have to do violence to some aspect of my own nature in order for me to turn the corner and begin to go forward. And so all of this negative experience has been an investment in my freedom. I invest it in a way that teaches me that this is not going to work. And we tend not to really believe anybody who tells us it's not going to work. We only find out that it's not going to work when we actually find out it's not going to work. And even though we always want to spare those we care about the pain of having to learn a lesson, but would we ever actually want to spare those we care about the opportunity to learn a lesson? But you see how challenging that is, and how we just have to turn everything in a completely other way. I heard myself saying the soul's evolution, the soul's journey. Swamiji makes a distinction here. We get a little caught because of the words in English. You have the soul, you have the ego, and then you have the Sanskrit word, which is jiva. And jiva is that spark of individual consciousness that is the continuing self-aware unit that goes from body to body to body. And the jiva becomes identified with the body it's inhabiting. And the ego, Master said, is when the jiva becomes identified with that body. And so the ego then becomes, enemy is sort of the word, but it becomes the opposite of our spiritual freedom, because the jiva identified with the vehicle in which it's living is what keeps it bound. It becomes identified with the limited. See, there's Arjuna's problem. Arjuna is identified with his own body, and he is identified then, in the story. Arjuna was in fact a great free soul, but he's identified with his body and identifies all his relatives with their bodies, and so he hesitates to kill them. But the soul knows that I'm just wearing this body, and if it falls off of me, what difference does it make? And that's what Krishna then goes on to say. It doesn't make any difference if this body falls off, because the actual reality is the soul. And Swami also talks about soul evolution, which technically speaking isn't really, may not really be possible, because if the soul is a part of God and God is perfect, then this is the way the mind distracts itself from the real issue at hand, worrying about all these things. But Swami says, as distinct, physical from physical evolution, when you talk about soul evolution, you're talking about an increase in awareness. That's what soul evolution is. It's like the jiva, the identity, the self-definition of the jiva shifts from ego, which is identification with the limited, to identification with the infinite. And the soul, that soul evolution, is the jiva's sense of itself is beginning to change. And that's what we do as we become more aware. Evolution in this sense is the expansion of awareness. Am I this body and therefore I have to fear death? Or am I the infinite spirit and therefore death is just an inevitable and welcome when it comes, because it signals a completion of a certain journey and the assumption of another one. So finally, at chapter 2, verse 11, Sri Krishna says to Arjuna, With words of love you have been grieving over those who deserve no lamentation. The wise mourn neither for those who live on earth nor for those who leave it. I always enjoy, in another place, Krishna says to Arjuna, you're pretending to be wise, but you're really actually being rather stupid here. Because Arjuna has gathered up these spiritual ideas of why he doesn't have to fight. But what Krishna sees is just that he's not willing to do his duty. And there's nothing laudable about not willing to do your duty, no matter how you clothe it. So, of course, I don't want to be a spoiler alert here. Isn't that how they say that? But Arjuna does fight in the end. That's how it happens. But the other factor about this is that we have to also realize, even beyond the fact that the jiva continues eternally, is the fact that even to kill the physical body does not even liberate the jiva from delusion, because there's three bodies. There's the physical body, the astral body, and the causal body. And these three realities are always in place. And so this is why physical suicide, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because people try it thinking that they can kill their consciousness merely by ending the animation of the body. But what happens is they take off the physical body and they're just, the next body is the astral body, and that's the energy body. That's the one that makes so many good movie plots these days, when the person just is still there, but they're no longer physical. They walk through the walls and they can't be heard or seen by physical beings, but they're still as defined and attached by a body as they were when they were in a physical body. They've just moved back one level. And the astral worlds is where we go between physical incarnations, and on that level we can still make progress, because we can realize that just as we weren't our physical body, we're not our energy vibration either. And the energy vibration then can go even one step higher, which is into the mere idea. Of course, I can't articulate anything with much magnetism about these things because I don't really understand them. I have a little bit more understanding of the astral world, but the causal world is not a world that I can access, although I have such a love of ideas now that I think about it. And in truth, I probably am living there a lot more than I know. But you have to lose the identification with the physical, lose the identification with the astral, and then even transcend the causal level. Master described it as like three bottles, and the outside bottle is the physical body, and the second bottle inside is the astral, and the third bottle is the causal. So if you think of them as like, that's what makes you a bubble on the ocean of spirit. If you crack the outside bubble, you don't merge with spirit. If you crack the second bubble, you still don't merge with spirit. You don't merge with the whole ocean until you crack the third. And so, unfortunately, when someone commits suicide, all they do is they find themselves in the energy world. And the energy world is all the vibrations of feeling and thought are still present. And it's the vibrations of feeling and thought that drive people to want to end their lives, to take off their bodies. Even if it's a physical sensation, for example, terrible pain or paralysis that makes them want to get out of that body, it's the feeling and the thought that physical experience generates that causes them to want to shed the body. We're in a very interesting time now because we have this, whatever they call it, where a person can choose to die and just choose to step out of their body. It should be said clearly that the karma of actions that one takes is dependent a great deal on your intention and your understanding at the time. We have to understand that God is no tyrant. I've had people, for example, come who at one point in their life perhaps had terminated a pregnancy, and then later saw that whole situation in a very different light, having to do with God's will and what to speak of the life force and all of that. But whenever people have come to Swamiji on this subject with a tremendous amount of anguish over the karma, not just fear for themselves, but just anguish over the whole situation, Swami has always been just the soul of sympathetic compassion, and basically said, you're judged by what you intended at the time. And there was no evil intended. It was just, in most cases, it was just what you thought was the right thing to do at the time. I know in one particular case, the woman was so worried, and Swami just so sweetly and very authoritatively said, "Oh, that child's been reincarnated long since." Just as simple as that. Because when you terminate a pregnancy, there's two karmas involved. And the soul that was seeking to be born, and the mother who chose not to bring that birth to fruition. And both are involved. So even the mother or the father who makes the decision is also acting in tandem with the karma of someone else. It's very complicated. You can't just what I was saying earlier, you can't just draw straight lines and say this is how it is. And people who do that eventually will have to learn that that doesn't work. I remember once when something very difficult happened in the community, and it had to do with human attraction and what I call the difference between karma and dharma. You can have a lot of karma with someone, but you might not have a lot of dharma with someone. But these things happen. And that's exactly what Swami said. Two things. First, he just sort of said, these things happen. It's just, this is the world we live in. And the second is, you can't always control the feelings of the heart. You can't always just dictate how you are or are not going to feel. You just have to act as sincerely as you can and trust that God is no tyrant. I mean, just even trusting that God is no tyrant is an important part of the spiritual path. I knew this woman once. I'm way off track here, but we'll come back. I'm not that far off track. This woman that I knew, she was had a very large body. I mean, she was way overweight. So she did not have a conventional female beauty. She had a great heart, and she was a fine lady. And she was involved in, not exactly pornography, but she was involved in sexuality in a very active way. Not so much in her own life, but she was really tried to help everybody have marvelous sexual experiences. That was like that was her hobby, okay? And she was obese because, she had a passion for food. She just was a very, very sensual person, even though she was very bright. And I should say, she was very bright, very intellectual, very capable. She was a really good businesswoman, but she also had this incredible sensual indulgence side and enthusiasm that she shared. And she said, and she believed this was true, and I think it had been endorsed, she said she'd been the Mother Superior of a convent and had just spent, more than one lifetime judging everybody. And finally, it just broke down. Either she had a revelation, or she needed to be trapped herself in this uncontrollable wave of desire, so she could understand that it isn't just a question of drawing lines and squeezing yourself into it, that there's many other forces. And, she recognized that perhaps this wasn't her ultimate destiny, but it was a necessary correction for her to gain compassion for how other people live. This is where, when I say I've never had to compromise my idealism, but I've had to continually expand my understanding of what the truth really is, this is where all of these factors begin to come together. So, now Krishna has told Arjuna that you're grieving for that which never dies, so why are you mourning for that which isn't even hurt? And then he goes through many verses here. He goes from verse 12 all the way to verse 29, verse 32 in this second chapter. And what he really talks about, and I'll let you read it because I've spent a lot of time on other things, but he's talking about how death really doesn't happen in the way we think it happens. And he says verses, how can one who knows the true self to be imperishable, everlasting, unborn, and unchanging, imagine that the self can cause destruction to another self? So he's saying to Arjuna, if you know your own true nature, how can you imagine for a minute, merely because you're taking off this body, that you're actually taking away someone's soul? He's trying to explain to him why he's lamenting for that which shouldn't be lamented for. He says, that which is unreal does not exist. That which is real cannot cease to exist. Those who possess wisdom know that the final nature of Those who possess wisdom know the final nature of reality, of what is and what is not. And then he talks also about how even, however, if you prefer to think of the self as perishable, why grieve? What is born must die. What dies must be born again. Why lament that which cannot be avoided? You know that phrase, why lament that which cannot be avoided? It's interesting when I look back on my own life, and I'm sure many of you all can have the same experience, to realize because of this fact of reincarnation, because when we come to these spiritual truths, we're coming to it, especially when we come to it with a kind of passionate zeal. This cannot be the first time that we're hearing about it. This can't be just the first time that it crossed our mind that there might be something else. We've practiced these teachings before. Otherwise, you touch them, but you don't spend a Friday night watching a webinar. It's not that important to you. And a lot of times, people are talking about trying to convert their relatives or their friends, and you can get a friend sometimes to be interested for a minute or two. Maybe you can even spend half an hour. And then to your amazement, my amazement, although I've gotten used to it, they're just never interested after that. I mean, just the simple phrase, frankly, I'm not interested. Whereas it stands perhaps in your mind, in my mind, as just absolutely compelling. It just doesn't compel other people. They're still playing out, they're still investing their energy in other experiences. Let me think what I was going to say on this. Actually, somehow I lost the thought. I was going to speak of the point I was going to make, and I had an example which I've now lost. Oh yes, why lament that cannot be avoided? Or, yes, why lament that which cannot be avoided, talking about death. One of the things I remember, I went to college for 1 year only. And then I was they offered me knowledge, and I was looking for wisdom. And as soon as that year was over, I discovered self-realization, which was wisdom. And I wasn't interested in knowledge after that, or that kind of knowledge. But one of my experiences of observing the other women that I was going to school with, it was mostly characteristic of the women, was this great difficulty in accepting reality. Just wanting things to be other than they were, to such an extent that they would continue to suffer rather than accept that what they wanted was never going to come to them. Now, of course, I've had a lot more experiences myself now, and I have much more compassion and I have a much more metaphysical understanding of how that syndrome works, and how the vrittis get started in the chakras, and how you've invested a lot of energy into that wrong thought, and it's not as simple as just saying, oh, I think I'll change. You have to reinvest that energy in another direction. But nonetheless, in principle, why lament that which cannot be avoided? Such as, this person is never going to marry me, I may not have the money or the relationship that I expected. I have a thyroid condition and I'm never going to be slim. Whatever it might be, my child is a disappointment. Just so many things in life just are. And of course, death is the big one. And that's where that's why the Gita is set up right where it's set up, and that's right where it starts. The whole beginning of the Gita is that Arjuna wants it to be different. And see, also, as I've grown older and had more life experience, really, in this life experience, I knew the principle then. I didn't have the compassion and understanding that it was harder to live by than I knew. But that's why the Gita begins just in such a powerful way. There are circumstances that must be faced, and Arjuna does not want to face them. And it centers around death, because death is such a magnificent illustration of our limited understanding of the nature of reality. And it's such a magnificent opportunity for Krishna to come from above and say, no, this is what's really happening. This is what it looks like to you, but this is what's really happening. Master made just the most interesting statement, which I contemplate a lot. You know, human birth, everyone's so excited when a baby is going to be born. You know, it's just so delightful, especially if the child is much loved and coming into a home where, you know, the child is really and joyfully anticipated and really wanted, and everybody's so happy, everybody but the baby. The baby always starts by crying. And Master said, actually the baby cries because it realizes that it's now in the physical world again, that it's now launched on a whole other material incarnation, and whatever freedom it had in the astral world is now gone. And because the material world is more binding, more limiting. The astrological moment, timing moment of the beginning of the incarnation is the first physical breath, because that's the commitment to being in a physical body. And so the baby doesn't cry until the baby breathes in, and then almost all babies begin to cry at that point. And Master said it's not because it hurts them to breathe physically, because it hurts them to realize, oh dear, I'm starting all over again. When I see little babies, I recently saw a friend's darling little tiny son, all dressed in his little onesie and his little diaper, and you know, he just was so tiny, and beautiful, beautiful, warm, intelligent eyes. Really a very wide awake little tiny person in this extremely undignified body. Oh my God, you have so much in front of you. You know, you've just barely begun. You have so much to do. I don't really think it's that different for us. I think the masters look at us all grown up in our little onesies, and we look just the same. I mean, like, what is the difference, really, compared to being a saint? But the point, now let me just find that point again. Oh yes, Master said, it's a celebration in the physical plane, and it's a funeral in the astral world. And then when the soul breathes its last and leaves this planet, it's lamentation, it's a funeral in this world, and it's a welcome home celebration in the astral world. It's just like, oh, there you are. It's so nice to see you again. And we're just always moving back and forth like this. And what is there to grieve in the unavoidable? We do lose contact, we think, but then Krishna makes it also very clear, you know, nothing is lost. Whatever actual, you know, true union of spirit, it's like just your child goes to college or takes a trip across the country, or your husband works late at the office, or whatever it might be. Separations occur, but no severance actually occurs. And just circumstances roll on. And time being the illusion that it is, when we're reunited, also on another level, we realize we were never really separated. We just couldn't see each other. And all of this, Krishna says to Arjuna. And then there comes another really important point here, and this is what the rest of the Gita is all about. What Krishna is explaining to Arjuna is what they, I mean, just in very broad terms, what they call in India the Sankhya philosophy. And the Sankhya philosophy is, why would you seek God? You know, why go to all the trouble to practice yoga? In the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, it begins, now we come to the practice of yoga. And in Swami Kriyananda's Patanjali commentary, I was looking back here to see if I have it, Demystifying Patanjali, which is a wonderful book, based on Yogananda's explanation of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And I did a very long class on this book, which I highly recommend, because it's not easy to understand, even though Swami did a great job. But it starts with, now we come to the practice of yoga. And Master speaks of all that happens before we get that word now. And that's exactly what this book says too. Now that I've explained to you the unreal nature of this universe, now we have to talk about what we're going to do about it. And when I'm speaking about our talking to our friends who are not interested, they haven't come to that now. They haven't really seen a reason to not just live in this world the way it seems. I'll get season tickets to the Stanford football games, and maybe I'll go up to the city and watch the opera and, come sit next to me while we watch this great television show. And how about we go to the lake this weekend? And, just on and on and on, which is what we see people do. And not necessarily even in not a crude or necessarily a bad way or an unloving way or an undignified way or a selfish way, but just taking it like it is and adjusting to the reality as we see it. And when we talk about we, meaning those of us who are convinced that we have to concentrate on a different level of what's happening here, they don't see it. They take the suffering that necessarily comes with that, with good grace or with bad grace, but it doesn't occur to them that there's something wrong with the entire approach. Speaking again of life before I understood, I remember being 10 years old, looking out the picture window of the house we had, looking at the neighborhood and watching the guy over there mowing his lawn. And I remember like squinting my eyes and squishing up my concentration, thinking if I could just look hard enough at it, it would reveal itself to me. I mean, it was a karmic memory that this simply can't be what it seems to be. This really can't be life. And that was, when I was saying at the beginning, that was my incredible anxiety, which was that this was it. And that the only thing I could do is just, among the choices that were being offered me, I could take one of them and then just live as if this were it. Of course, my karma was so different than that. But that was my fear, because growing up in America, in the household I grew up in, nobody knew. I thought they were just holding out on me, would tell me later, but nobody knew, or even cared enough to really look. That's what Shankya is about. Arjuna comes to a crisis point. I just can't do this. And Krishna says, yes, you can, because you're actually doing something else. And so then the second of the three understandings, which are not really different one from another, it's Shankya, it's Yoga, it's Vedanta. Shankya is why. Why go to all this effort to go to battle with your own nature, to completely reform and redirect your own consciousness? Why would you do that? Well, that's because otherwise life is nothing but suffering. It's the only course to happiness. If you know that, it's self-evident. If you don't, you can't be persuaded of it. You have to invest more in other experiences. And then yoga tells you what to do. And then this is what Krishna explains. And he's not explaining yoga postures, which is what people think yoga is. That's just this, tiny little thread. It's how to live, how to understand, and above all, how to meditate, how to redirect your entire consciousness, just like I was trying to do when I was 10, so you can actually look at it, and see it with a capital I. But it's all of that. That's what yoga is. And then Vedanta, the last part of this, is the philosophical, the articulation of the true nature of reality. Krishna, in talking about death, is talking about the true nature of reality. But Vedanta really talks about the oneness of creation. And you can read that and then you understand what the goal of yoga is. But Shankya has to be, death comes to everyone, death is an illusion, death can be mastered, all of this false identity can be overcome. Wow, why would I do anything else? If that's how your constituted, then the answer to that is, why would I do anything else? And one puts one's foot on the path, and now we begin. And this is now, Krishna is going to tell Arjuna what to do about the dilemma he's facing, and in so doing teach all of us. So that's where we'll go next. God bless you.